August 1945. The war was over. In a humid POW camp, a line of Japanese military doctors stood in their blood-stained uniforms, bracing for the worst. Propaganda had told them American soldiers were monsters. That capture meant punishment. They expected prison, or even a shallow grave. But when a U.S. captain faced them, he didn't give them shackles. He gave them an impossible order. He looked at their skilled hands and said, "Our wounded are piling up. You're doctors. Treat them." These captured Japanese doctors expected prison, but the Americans asked them to save their lives instead. To see how sworn enemies became battlefield saviors, hit that subscribe button for more untold stories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love to see how far these histories travel. The air in the Philippines in August of 1945 was a thick, wet blanket, woven from mud, rot, and the lingering scent of cordite. For the handful of captured Japanese military doctors, it was the smell of defeat. They stood in a dusty clearing, ringed by barbed wire, their once white uniforms stained with the blood of men they could not save. Heat shimmered above the red earth. They were prisoners now, their purpose stripped away, leaving only the hollow ache of surrender. Among them, Dr. Kenji Saito stood straightest, a lifetime of discipline holding his spine rigid against the humidity and the fear. At 38, he had seen enough death to fill 1,000 lifetimes. But the quiet humiliation of this moment was a new kind of wound. He watched the American guards, young men with faces hardened by a war they had won, and saw the monsters from the propaganda posters. They would be interrogated, broken, made useless. He leaned slightly toward his young assistant, Taro, whose eyes were wide with a terror Kenji felt but could not show. "They'll make us useless," Kenji whispered, the words barely audible above the chirping of unseen insects. "We are prisoners now." Nothing more. Just then, a different kind of American appeared. He was an officer, his uniform impossibly clean, his posture radiating an authority that felt both absolute and weary. Captain Daniel Reeves stopped a few feet from the line of Japanese men, his gaze sweeping over them, lingering for a moment on the dark, dried stains on their sleeves. His face was a mask of stern neutrality, but Kenji saw something else in his eyes, a deep, settled bitterness, the look of a man who carried his own ghosts. The prisoners braced themselves for the command that would seal their fate: hard labor, interrogation, or worse. Reeves's jaw was tight, as if the words he was about to speak were a heavy weight on his tongue. When he finally spoke, his voice was not cruel but clipped, an order forged in pure necessity. "We need you," he said, the statement landing with the force of a physical blow. The prisoners stared, uncomprehending. Reeves gestured with his chin toward a large tent from which the low moan of human suffering escaped. "Our wounded are piling up. We're short on surgeons." He paused, letting the impossible truth settle in the thick, humid air. "You're doctors, so you'll treat them." A ripple of shock went through the Japanese men. Some exchanged nervous glances, their minds racing. A trap? A cruel joke before the real punishment began? But for Kenji, the words cut through the fog of his despair. Doctor. The word was a lifeline. It was who he was, beyond the uniform, beyond victory or defeat. An hour later, he was standing over a young American GI, the metallic scent of fresh blood sharp in his nostrils. The soldier was a boy, no older than 20, with a shock of blonde hair matted with sweat. A piece of shrapnel from a jungle ambush had torn through his abdomen. The makeshift operating theater was tense enough to suffocate. An American medic stood by, his face a mixture of awe and suspicion, while a guard watched from the tent flap, his hand never leaving the pistol at his hip. But Kenji saw none of it. He saw only the wound. His hands, which he had expected to be bound in shackles, were steady as he held the scalpel. All the noise of the war, the propaganda, the hatred, it all fell away. There was only the quiet, focused rhythm of his work, the precise cut, the gentle probe, the careful stitch. He was not an enemy. He was not a prisoner. He was a surgeon, fighting his own war against death. When the operation was over and the boy was stabilized, a profound quiet filled the tent. The American medic simply nodded, his suspicion replaced by a grudging respect. Kenji felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a fragile, unfamiliar hope. He had a purpose again. Days later, the young soldier woke. He was weak, his voice a dry rasp, but his eyes were clear. He saw Kenji checking his bandages and lifted a hand slightly. Kenji leaned closer. The boy's lips moved, forming a single word, one of the few he knew in the language of his former enemy. Arigato. Thank you. The simple word was a bridge across an ocean of blood and misunderstanding. It was a recognition of a shared humanity that war could not erase. But just as that fragile bridge was built, the world ripped it apart. A worker from the Red Cross, a weary-looking woman with kind eyes, found him. She pressed a crumpled, smuggled letter into his hand. It was from home. Kenji's heart hammered against his ribs. He found a secluded spot behind a supply shed, the paper trembling in his fingers as he unfolded it. The characters were blurred by moisture, but the message was clear. It spoke of the great firebombing in Tokyo, of his neighborhood, leveled, of his wife, Aiko, her status confirmed. She had survived. But then came the next line, the one that stopped his breath. His son, little hero, age 5. Location, unknown, presumed, gone. The world tilted. The disciplined surgeon, the man who held life and death in his hands without flinching, crumpled. He sank to his knees in the dirt, the letter falling from his grasp. A single, ragged sob escaped him. Then another. The grief he had held at bay for so long finally breaking through his walls of restraint. He had just saved an enemy's son, only to learn he had lost his own. He was a doctor, but he could not heal this. He was a man, adrift in a world where everything he had known, his family, his country, his enemy, had been burned to ash. The war was over, but nothing would ever be the same again. Captain Daniel Reeves stood in the doorway of the supply tent he now called his office, watching the rain turn the compound into a sea of red-brown mud. Each drop that fell seemed to echo the relentless hammering in his head. From his vantage point, he could see the medical tent, a canvas island of flickering lamplight, where the impossible was happening. Inside, Japanese surgeons, men who a week ago were the enemy, were saving American lives. His own orders had set this in motion, born of a desperate need for doctors, but the decision gnawed at him, a raw and festering wound. Every time he saw Dr. Saito, with his quiet competence and unnervingly steady hands, another image superimposed itself. His younger brother David, gaunt and skeletal, in the single photograph that had made it out of Bataan before the fall. David was gone, dead at the hands of men who wore the same uniform as the doctors, now working under Reeves's protection. He clenched his fist, the paper in his hand crinkling. It was a report on medical supply levels, but it might as well have been an accusation. He was a commander. His duty was to his men. But how could he reconcile that duty with trusting their lives to the very people who had taken his brothers? The anger was a hot, familiar poison in his throat. Inside the medical tent, Dr. Kenji Saito moved through his tasks with the detached precision of an automaton. The grief for his son was a hollow space inside him, a silence so profound that the groans of the wounded barely registered. He cleaned instruments, checked sutures, and changed dressings, his mind a merciful blank. Doctoring was all he had left. It was a ritual, a set of movements that kept the hollowness from consuming him entirely. He was adjusting the drip for a young GI, a boy from Ohio with a severe leg wound, when the soldier stirred. "Doc," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Kenji paused, turning to him. The soldier fumbled inside his shirt and pulled out a worn, creased photograph encased in protective celluloid. He held it up. It was a picture of a smiling young woman holding a bundled baby. "That's my girl, and little Jimmy," the soldier said, a proud, weak smile on his face. He looked at Kenji. "You got kids?" The question was a physical blow. Kenji's carefully constructed wall of numbness fractured. He saw his son's face, laughing as he chased a dragonfly in their Tokyo garden. He could almost feel the small hand in his. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He managed a single, stiff nod, unable to form words. Swallowing the grief that threatened to choke him, he gently pushed the soldier's hand back toward his chest, securing the photograph. Then he turned away, before the boy could see the tears welling in his eyes. Later that evening, a quiet rhythm settled over the ward. Nurse Aiko Tanaka, a young Red Cross volunteer, moved between the cots, her movements graceful and efficient. While changing a dressing, she began to hum, a soft, simple melody from her childhood. It was a lullaby, a tune to soothe and comfort. A few cots away, Private Tommy Keller, the young medic from Iowa, froze. He looked over at Aiko, his expression one of pure disbelief. "Hey," he whispered to the man next to him, "my neighbor Mr. Fujimoto back home. His wife used to hum that to their kid." In the dim light of the tent, surrounded by suffering, the simple folk song became a fragile thread connecting two worlds, a reminder of a time before the lines had been drawn. But the thread was easily broken. The next morning, a new patient was brought in, a stocky sergeant named Frank Doyle, with a deep gash in his arm from a piece of shrapnel. Kenji approached his cot to examine the wound. Doyle's eyes snapped open. "Get him away from me," he snarled, trying to sit up. "I'd rather die than let a Jap cut me open." The ward fell silent. All eyes turned to the confrontation. Captain Reeves, making his morning rounds, strode over, his face grim. "He's the only surgeon available, Sergeant," Reeves said, his voice cold and flat. Doyle spat on the dirt floor. "I don't care. Sir?" Reeves's jaw tightened. He felt a flash of understanding for Doyle's hatred. It was a mirror of his own. But discipline was absolute. Order was all they had. "He will treat you, and you will let him. That's an order." He held Doyle's furious gaze until the sergeant finally lay back, his body rigid with defiance. The trust, if it ever existed, had shown itself to be gossamer thin. Yet, a few days later, a different soldier lay dying from a fever that no one could stop. A young Japanese medic, not much older than the American boy in the cot, had sat with him for hours, cooling his brow with damp cloths. In a final moment of lucidity, the dying soldier opened his eyes. He looked at the medic, his enemy, the one who had cared for him at the end. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the medic's arm. "You tried to save me," he whispered, the words faint but clear. "I forgive you." The medic recoiled slightly, stunned. The words hung in the air, a final, unexpected act of grace that left everyone who heard it shaken and silent. The mud began to dry. Under the relentless Philippine sun, the chaotic camp started to resemble something more permanent, more orderly. The medical tent, once a desperate theater of blood and confusion, was now a proper field ward. Cots were arranged in neat rows, supplies were organized, and a sense of shared, weary purpose had settled over its inhabitants. Americans and Japanese now worked side by side, their movements synchronized by the universal demands of healing. Young Tommy Keller, the American medic, had become Dr. Saito's shadow, his farm boy eagerness a stark contrast to Kenji's quiet, methodical grace. He learned how to tie a surgeon's knot, how to anticipate the need for a clamp, and how to speak a language of gestures and knowing glances that transcended words. Captain Reeves watched it all from a distance, a knot of conflict tightening in his gut. The reports didn't lie. Fewer men were dying from infections, and recovery times were improving. He couldn't deny Kenji's skill. The man was more than a doctor. He was an artist of flesh and bone. One afternoon, Reeves entered the ward holding a small stack of surgical reports. He walked directly to Kenji, who was cleaning his instruments. Reeves laid the papers on the small table. "These are for you," he said, his voice flat. Kenji looked at him, confused. "The official records. They need the lead surgeon's signature." He held out a fountain pen. It was a simple object, but in that moment, it felt as heavy as a sword. Kenji took it, his fingers tracing the smooth black casing. He was not an anonymous prisoner. He was the lead surgeon. He uncapped the pen and, with a hand that had not shaken through a single operation, he wrote his name, Dr. Kenji Saito. The act was a restoration. It was a single vital piece of himself given back. A few days later, a small group gathered on a hill overlooking the camp. They stood before 2 rows of fresh graves, one marked with simple wooden crosses, the other with plain markers. It was a joint burial for the men who had been lost, both American and Japanese. A chaplain read a passage from the Bible, his voice a low comfort. Afterwards, in the silence, one of the Japanese nurses sang a quiet song of mourning. There were no flags, no anthems, only the shared, undeniable weight of loss. For a brief moment, standing under a wide, clear sky, they were not enemies or victors or prisoners. They were just people, mourning their dead. And as Reeves stood a few feet from Kenji, he felt the first, unwelcome thaw around his frozen heart. It was in this atmosphere of fragile hope that the next blow landed. A Red Cross runner arrived during a rare moment of calm in the ward. Tommy Keller was telling a rambling story about a runaway pig back on his farm, and the sound of quiet, exhausted laughter was in the air. The runner handed a letter to Kenji, his second from home. The small ripple of laughter died as everyone watched him. He opened it, his face a mask of desperate hope. He read the first few lines, and a wave of profound relief washed over him. His wife, Aiko, was safe, truly safe. He closed his eyes for a moment in gratitude. Then he read on. The relief vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying stillness. The letter confirmed what the first had only suggested. His son, Hiro, was gone. Not missing. Gone. The paper fluttered from his fingers. He didn't cry out. He simply folded in on himself, sinking to the ground as if his bones had turned to dust. The sight of the unshakable Dr. Saito, the man who held them all together, utterly broken, shattered the ward's fragile peace. The silence that followed was thick with shared horror. But it was Sergeant Frank Doyle who filled it with poison. He'd been holding a small leather-bound book, a diary taken from a dead Japanese officer. He chose this moment to open it. "Listen to this fanatic," he sneered, his voice loud and mocking. He began to read a passage aloud, twisting the dead man's words about honor and homeland into a caricature of blind devotion. "Says here he was proud to fight, proud to die for his emperor." Doyle looked around at the other Americans, his eyes glinting. "Proud to kill our boys." The air crackled with renewed hostility. The Japanese medics stiffened, their faces hardening at the desecration of a dead comrade's thoughts. One of the American guards, emboldened by Doyle's words, stepped toward Taro, Kenji's young assistant. "What are you looking at?" he snarled, and shoved him hard. Taro stumbled back. Another guard moved in. In a flash, the ward was on the verge of exploding. Reeves burst through the tent flap, his face a thundercloud. "Enough!" he roared, his voice cracking like a whip. He physically threw himself between his guards and the Japanese doctors, his hand flying to the pistol on his hip. "Stand down, all of you!" The guards reluctantly backed away, their faces still contorted with rage. The Japanese doctors huddled together, their eyes flashing with a defiance that hadn't been there moments before. The fragile bridge of trust, built over weeks of shared work and quiet understanding, had been demolished in seconds. Reeves stood in the wreckage, his heart pounding, a cold dread washing over him. The Mercy experiment was over. It had been a fool's errand from the start. The monsoon rains returned with a vengeance, beating a relentless, mournful rhythm on the canvas roof of the medical tent. Inside, the ward was half empty, the silence as oppressive as the humid air. A vicious outbreak of malaria had swept through the camp, stealing away men whom bullets and shrapnel had spared. The brief period of unity had evaporated, leaving behind a bitter residue of suspicion and old hatreds. Captain Daniel Reeves sat alone at his makeshift desk, the flickering lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the tent walls. He stared at the roster of the dead, both American and Japanese, their names blurring together in a testament to his failure. Why did we show them mercy? The question circled in his mind, a vulture of doubt. He had risked the trust of his own men for an idea, a fleeting hope that humanity could prevail. And for what? For a brief moment of fragile peace, now shattered and drowned in the rain. He remembered the look in Sergeant Doyle's eyes, not just hatred, but betrayal. Reeves had broken the simple, unwritten rule of war. You take care of your own. You do not help the enemy. The weight of his brother's memory felt heavier than ever. Across the compound, Dr. Kenji Saito felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of the ward. He had not truly recovered from his collapse. The news of his son's death had hollowed him out, and the subsequent explosion of hostility had filled that hollowness with a cold, weary resignation. He performed his duties mechanically, his movements precise but lacking the spark of purpose that had briefly reignited within him. The Americans barely spoke to him, and his own men kept their heads down, the shame of their captivity now compounded by renewed animosity. Taro had a fresh bruise on his cheek where the guard had shoved him. We are prisoners still, Kenji thought, as he stitched a wound on a silent, sullen American soldier. Even with scalpels in our hands. The illusion of dignity had been just that, an illusion. He was a tool, a temporary convenience for his captors, nothing more. He was a father with no son, a husband with no home, a doctor with no standing. Just when the despair in the camp seemed to have reached its absolute lowest point, a new crisis erupted. It wasn't malaria this time, but a swift, violent intestinal sickness that struck with terrifying speed. It began with a few men, then a dozen, then scores. And it was indiscriminate. It tore through the American barracks and the Japanese POW enclosure with equal ferocity, leveling soldiers and prisoners alike. The camp's own medical staff was overwhelmed in a matter of hours. Men were dying, dehydrated and delirious, and the few American doctors left standing were on the verge of collapse. Panic began to set in. Reeves stood in the pouring rain, watching stretcher after stretcher being carried into the overflowing ward. He saw the pale, sweat-soaked faces of his men, and he saw the equally terrified faces of the Japanese prisoners. In that moment, watching a shared enemy, disease, cut them all down, a stark, undeniable truth struck him. There was no us and them anymore. There was only the living and the dying. The rules of war were meaningless in the face of this. There was only one choice. He strode into the medical tent, his boots splashing through puddles on the muddy floor. The scene was chaos. Kenji was moving from cot to cot, directing his small team of Japanese medics with a quiet, desperate authority, trying to administer what little medicine they had. Reeves walked straight to him. The entire ward fell silent, every eye fixed on the two men. This was it, the final breaking point. Reeves looked at Kenji, not as a conqueror to a prisoner, but as one commander to another. He saw the profound exhaustion in the surgeon's eyes, but he also saw an unbreakable core of competence. "I'm putting you in charge," Reeves said, his voice clear and loud, ringing through the cavernous tent. He unpinned the small medical insignia from his own collar and held it out. "Full authority! Over the ward, the supplies, the men, all of them." He pressed the pin into Kenji's hand. "Not prisoner," he said, his voice dropping slightly, but his words sharp enough for everyone to hear. "Doctor." The gesture was monumental. It was a public transfer of power, an act of radical trust witnessed by everyone. For a long moment, Kenji simply stared at the small piece of metal in his palm. Then, slowly, he looked up and met Reeves's gaze. A flicker of the old fire returned to his eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. The chaos in the ward did not magically disappear, but it shifted. Under Kenji's calm, decisive leadership, it became an organized battle. He created triage stations, separated the contagious, and directed joint teams of American and Japanese medics. Hands that had been raised in anger were now working together, holding down convulsing patients, administering fluids, cleaning filth. For 48 hours, they fought. They fought side by side in a storm of sickness and rain, bound by a single, desperate goal: to keep everyone breathing. When the fever finally broke, the sun emerged, weak and watery, but there. The ward was littered with the exhausted, sleeping forms of the survivors and their saviors. Young Tommy Keller, his face streaked with grime and tears, sat slumped against a tent pole. He looked at Reeves, his eyes wide, with a dawning realization. "Sir," he whispered, his voice cracking, if Dr. Saito hadn't, I'd be dead. We'd all be dead." The truth was no longer a matter of opinion or debate. It was a fact, written on the faces of the living. The war was ending, and the first transports were being arranged to take prisoners home. The day before he was set to leave, Kenji was given a simple paper certificate, stamped and signed by the U.S. Army. It did not mention his prisoner number. It read simply, "Dr. Kenji Saito, service rendered to American wounded, 1945. It was the restoration of his name, his profession, his honor. Tucked inside was a folded personal letter from Captain Reeves. Kenji opened it. "I swore I'd never forgive what your country did to my brother," it read. "I thought revenge was the only honor I had left. But mercy changed us both. Thank you." Years later, in a small, rebuilt neighborhood in Tokyo, a new clinic opened. The simple sign above the door read, "Mercy First." And on the wall inside, beside the red cross of a healer, hung a framed letter, a quiet testament to two enemies whose hands, once tied by war, were now bound forever by the lives they had saved together.